Racist pilot attacks Snoop Dogg, but what happened next shocked everyone. Fiction story. The soft hum of the airplane filled the cabin as passengers settled into their seats, the lights dimmed for the night flight. Snoop Dogg, wearing a casual jacket and his signature sunglasses, was seated comfortably in first class, headphones on, leaning back with a relaxed expression. It was just another flight for him. A simple trip from one city to another, but little did he know, tonight would not be an ordinary journey. As the plane ascended into the night sky, the seatbelt signs went off and the crew began moving through the aisles. The pilot's voice crackled through the intercom, low and gruff. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We're cruising at a steady altitude, so sit back and relax. We'll be flying smoothly into our destination," the pilot said, his voice carrying an air of confidence. "And of course, as always, enjoy your flight." Snoop Dogg relaxed even further, leaning his head against the window, his fingers tapping rhythmically on the armrest to the beat of his favorite track. But then, something unusual happened. The pilot's voice came through again, but this time, there was a noticeable sneer in his tone. "And I'd like to welcome one of our special guests aboard today," the pilot said, his voice louder now, as though he was addressing only one person. "Snoop Dogg. I hope you've got some of that magic with you, Mr. Dogg. Maybe you can light up the cabin with your special skills, huh?" A few heads turned in the cabin, and Snoop paused, his fingers stopping mid-tap. He looked around, scanning the faces of the nearby passengers. Some were chuckling nervously, others looked uncomfortable, but no one said a word. Snoop slowly removed his headphones and leaned back in his seat, his face calm but a flicker of something in his eyes, something between disbelief and annoyance. He had heard comments like this before, but it never failed to get under his skin. The plane continued its ascent, and the pilot, seemingly emboldened, took it further. "I'm sure you're used to flying high, right, Snoop?" The pilot's voice now had an edge to it, dripping with condescension. "Maybe you should stick to the things you're good at, like rapping and smoking. Flying seems a little too sophisticated for someone like you." The cabin went still, a few gasps from passengers broke the silence, but no one moved, not sure what to do. Snoop looked around again, his expression unreadable. The crew hadn't reacted yet. They seemed to be waiting for something. Snoop's face tightened for a second, but then a calm, collected smirk spread across his lips. He raised his hand slowly, fingers spread wide in a peaceful gesture. His voice, when he spoke, was smooth but firm. "Yo, Captain, you got a problem with me? Let's talk about it." A few chuckles rippled through the cabin as the tension mounted. The pilot's voice returned, this time sounding irritated and a little defensive. "I don't have a problem with you, Mr. Dogg," the pilot said, his tone sharper now, almost as if he felt threatened. "But I do have a problem with people who think they can just walk in here and act like they own the place." Snoop's eyes glinted. He knew exactly what was going on. This wasn't about him. This was about someone who saw Snoop Dogg as a target, someone who thought they could use their position to belittle and mock. Snoop sighed, leaning forward in his seat, his voice calm but edged with a hint of authority. "Listen, man, I'm just here to get to my destination in peace. You got a problem with me? Fine. Let's talk about it like adults, not through this weird little power trip you got going on." He leaned back again, staring the pilot down in his mind, knowing that his words would land harder than any physical confrontation ever could. From the front of the plane, the door to the cockpit opened slightly, and the flight attendant stepped in, glancing nervously at the crew. She hesitated, then made her way to the back, where she addressed Snoop quietly. "Mr. Dogg, I'm so sorry about this. I'll speak to the captain," she said, her voice apologetic. "We don't tolerate this sort of thing on our flights." But Snoop, ever the professional, simply nodded. He didn't want to escalate things unnecessarily. "No problem, sweetheart. Just tell the captain I'd like to have a word with him after the flight. There's no need to make a scene." But the pilot had other plans. His voice returned over the intercom, now even more aggressive. "Mr. Dogg, I don't think you understand. You're not above the rules here. I run this plane, and I won't tolerate disrespect from anyone, especially not someone like you." Snoop's smirk faded. He had dealt with racism before, but this time, it was different. The aggression was palpable, and it was aimed directly at him. He had been calm up until now, but something inside him snapped. He stood up slowly, his tall frame towering over the rows of seats, and turned to face the rest of the cabin. "Yo, I'm not here to cause trouble," Snoop began, his voice carrying across the cabin. "But if someone's gonna disrespect me like that, I gotta step up. I don't care if you're the pilot, I don't care who you are. We don't play that game, not here. Not with me." At the back of the cabin, the flight attendants exchanged worried glances, clearly unsure of how to handle the situation. But what happened next shocked everyone, including Snoop himself. The door to the cockpit opened, and to everyone's surprise, the pilot emerged. He stormed into the cabin, his uniform stark against the backdrop of the mostly calm passengers. He looked directly at Snoop, chest puffed out, as if he were about to reprimand him. "You don't get to speak to me like that," the pilot spat, his voice thick with anger. "You don't belong here, and you'll respect my authority." Snoop raised his hands in the air, signaling that he wasn't looking for a fight. "All I'm saying is, we can talk this out," he said, his tone measured. "You can calm down and maybe we'll both get through this without anyone getting hurt." But the pilot wasn't listening. He took another step forward, his face red with fury. "I said you'll respect me," the pilot shouted. But just as the tension reached its peak, something unexpected happened. The flight attendants, who had been standing by, suddenly moved into action. They had been trained to de-escalate these kinds of situations, and in that moment, one of them stepped forward, speaking to the pilot firmly and with authority. "Captain, that's enough," she said, her voice calm but commanding. "You are threatening a passenger, and this behavior is completely unacceptable." The pilot's face twisted in rage, but the attendants had already made it clear that this situation wasn't going to end well for him. As he stood there, fuming, the rest of the passengers began to murmur in disbelief, unsure of what was happening. Snoop, still standing with his hands raised, shook his head and took a deep breath. "See? This is all I was trying to say," he said, looking around at the other passengers, who were watching the scene unfold with wide eyes. "We don't need to escalate things. Just treat me with respect, and I'll treat you the same." And then, something even more surprising occurred. The pilot's posture faltered, his anger deflating in an instant. His shoulders slumped, his face suddenly stricken with embarrassment. He had gone too far. Everyone in the cabin was watching, and he had lost control. But instead of shouting as he might have expected, the pilot stepped back, his gaze falling to the floor. "I apologize, Mr. Dogg," the pilot said, his voice much softer now. "That was uncalled for. I'm sorry." Snoop nodded slowly, still keeping his cool. "It's all good. Just, let's keep things professional. No need for all this." The pilot didn't say another word. He turned around and returned to the cockpit, and the cabin was quiet for a moment, as if the tension had been lifted in an instant. Snoop sat back down, the eyes of the passengers still on him, some of them clearly in awe. He had handled the situation with a calm that even the most seasoned diplomats might have envied. What had started as an encounter filled with racism and aggression had turned into an unexpected moment of accountability, not just for the pilot but for everyone on board. The cabin remained tense for a moment, the soft hum of the engines providing a strange contrast to the raw emotions that had just unfolded. Passengers exchanged wary glances, unsure of how to process what they had just witnessed. Some were still recovering from the pilot's outburst, while others quietly admired how Snoop Dogg had handled the situation with unmatched poise. Snoop leaned back in his seat, adjusting his sunglasses and flipping through his phone, acting as if nothing had happened. But his mind was far from calm. He had been in his fair share of confrontations, but this one felt different. The blatant racism he had encountered wasn't just an isolated incident, it was a reminder of the systemic prejudices that continued to run deep in society. But rather than react with anger or aggression, he had managed to maintain his cool, relying on wisdom and experience to defuse the situation. He knew the moment he had risen from his seat that things could have escalated quickly. A loud, public confrontation on a plane wasn't just uncomfortable, it was dangerous. But by staying level-headed, he had not only managed to avoid chaos but had also shown everyone in that cabin the power of handling adversity with grace. As the minutes passed and the plane continued its steady flight, the mood in the cabin started to settle. The passengers who had been tense earlier now relaxed slightly, some of them returning to their in-flight activities, while others whispered in hushed tones, likely discussing the unexpected drama that had just unfolded. A flight attendant approached Snoop Dogg's seat with a gentle smile, offering him a bottle of water. "Mr. Dogg, on behalf of the entire crew, I just want to say we're deeply sorry for what happened," she said, her voice warm and sincere. "That was completely out of line, and it's not something we ever want to happen on this flight. Thank you for handling it the way you did." Snoop nodded, accepting the bottle of water with a smile. "It's all good," he said, his voice still calm, though there was a hint of exhaustion in his tone. "Sometimes people just need a reminder that we're all here to respect each other, you know?" The flight attendant smiled again, her eyes reflecting gratitude. "We appreciate that more than you know, Mr. Dogg. You're a class act." Snoop chuckled softly. "Just keeping it cool," he said, taking a sip of the water. "We all have our moments, but it's how you handle them that counts." The attendant lingered for a moment, then walked back toward the front of the cabin, leaving Snoop to settle into his seat again. He leaned back, closing his eyes for a moment and letting the quiet of the flight wash over him. The adrenaline that had been coursing through him only moments before began to fade, replaced by a sense of relief. He had stood up for himself, and he had done so without giving in to the impulse to retaliate. That was something to be proud of. Meanwhile, up front in the cockpit, the pilot sat in the darkened space, hands gripping the controls more tightly than necessary. His mind was racing. What had just happened? How had things escalated so quickly? He had been in the air for years, but he had never found himself in a situation like this. The tension in his chest was palpable. He knew he had crossed a line. His outburst had been unprovoked, and now he couldn't shake the shame that was starting to settle in his stomach. He had been in a position of authority, but he had let his personal biases dictate his actions. Worse, he had humiliated himself in front of the entire plane. The co-pilot, sensing the change in atmosphere, glanced over at the pilot. "Are you all right?" he asked cautiously, his voice neutral. The pilot remained silent for a moment before letting out a deep breath. "No, I'm not all right," he admitted. "I screwed up. I don't know what came over me. I've never been so unprofessional." The co-pilot frowned. "What happened?" "I heard some of the back and forth over the intercom, but I didn't get the full picture." The pilot hesitated, rubbing his forehead. I don't even know how to explain it," he said, his voice tinged with frustration. "I let my own issues get the best of me. I've always prided myself on being in control, on maintaining professionalism, but today, I lost it. I let my personal biases get the better of me, and I took it out on Snoop Dogg of all people." The co-pilot nodded, his expression serious. "I think it's clear that there's more to this than just a passenger's presence. Maybe you need to think about what's been eating at you for a while. We all have our moments, but when we bring personal issues into work, it doesn't just affect us, it affects everyone around us." The pilot looked out the cockpit window, the lights of the city below blinking faintly in the distance. He knew the co-pilot was right. He had let his own prejudices, his own insecurities, dictate his actions. He had taken out years of frustration on Snoop, a man who didn't deserve to be treated that way. He took a deep breath, trying to collect himself. "I owe him an apology," the pilot said, finally breaking the silence. "And I owe everyone else on this flight an apology. I need to face the consequences of what I did." The co-pilot gave a small nod. "It's never easy, but it's the right thing to do." Back in the cabin, Snoop Dogg continued to sit in his seat, taking in the quiet of the flight. His mind wandered for a moment, thinking about everything that had transpired. It wasn't the first time he had encountered racism or prejudice in his life, but the way the situation had played out, so publicly and so heatedly, was something he wouldn't forget. The calm he had felt earlier had begun to shift into something more thoughtful, more introspective. He had handled the situation the best way he knew how, with patience, with wisdom, and without resorting to the kind of aggression that many might have expected. But now, as he sat there, he wondered what the pilot would do next. Would he continue to deny his actions, or would he take responsibility for the way he had treated Snoop and the rest of the passengers? He didn't have to wait long for an answer. A few minutes later, the pilot's voice crackled through the intercom, his tone noticeably more subdued than before. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. I'd like to take a moment to address something that happened earlier on this flight. I want to sincerely apologize for my unprofessional behavior toward Mr. Snoop Dogg. What I said was inappropriate and completely unacceptable. I allowed my personal biases to cloud my judgment, and I deeply regret my actions. I have always believed in maintaining respect for all passengers, regardless of who they are, and I failed to uphold that standard. I'm truly sorry, and I promise that this will not happen again." There was a brief silence, but it wasn't uncomfortable. The passengers seemed to appreciate the apology. It wasn't often that people in positions of power admitted their mistakes, let alone apologized for them. But this moment was different. The pilot had taken responsibility for his actions, and in doing so, had restored a sense of dignity to the situation. Snoop Dogg listened quietly, nodding to himself. He appreciated the apology, but more importantly, he appreciated that the pilot had recognized his own fault. It wasn't enough to just apologize, it was about taking steps to change and learn from the mistake. And Snoop knew that this pilot had done that, even if it had taken a little longer than expected. The flight continued on, the atmosphere in the cabin noticeably lighter. The tension that had been present earlier in the journey had dissipated, replaced by a sense of calm. Snoop Dogg leaned back in his seat once more, taking a deep breath and looking out the window. It had been an eventful flight, to say the least. But in the end, it wasn't just about confronting a racist pilot, it was about showing that, even in the face of hostility, there was always a better way to handle things. And Snoop had shown everyone aboard that it was possible to rise above hate, to respond with dignity, and to make the world a little better with each choice we made. The plane settled into its flight path, the soft hum of the engines providing a sense of rhythm, as if the entire aircraft had settled after the storm of emotions that had passed through it. Snoop Dogg had returned to his relaxed state, the feeling of calm that had momentarily left him now settling back into his bones. He didn't know what the rest of the flight would hold, but one thing was clear: he had turned a potentially explosive situation into a moment of growth for everyone involved. As the evening wore on, the flight attendants made their rounds again, offering drinks and snacks, attempting to return the atmosphere to normal. Most passengers had already forgotten about the confrontation, or at least they were pretending to. But Snoop knew that the message had been sent, not just to the pilot, but to everyone on board. The power of kindness, composure, and accountability had prevailed over bigotry and arrogance. It was a victory, no matter how small. An hour or so into the flight, a tap on Snoop's shoulder interrupted his thoughts. He looked up to find one of the flight attendants standing beside him, a soft smile on her face. "Mr. Dogg," she said quietly, "the captain would like to speak with you when you're ready." Snoop raised an eyebrow, wondering what the pilot had in mind after his public apology. "All right," he said casually, "lead the way." Snoop stood up and followed the attendant through the narrow aisle of the cabin, his mind a bit on edge. He had already received the apology, so he wasn't sure what else the pilot could want. Maybe it was a formality, or maybe it was a follow-up to ensure things hadn't gone too far. The cockpit door opened, and the flight attendant stepped aside to let him in. The pilot stood behind the controls, looking much less confident than before. His posture was slumped, and his face looked tired, but his eyes held a sense of remorse, the apology still fresh in his demeanor. "Mr. Dogg," the pilot began, his voice much quieter than before. "I can't thank you enough for how you handled everything earlier. You showed me something I didn't expect. You reminded me that my actions, no matter how small, affect those around me. And I'm sorry for what I said. I truly regret my behavior." Snoop looked at the pilot for a moment, his eyes searching. He could sense that the man wasn't just apologizing because he had to, but because he genuinely felt the weight of his words. "I appreciate the apology, man," Snoop said calmly. "But it's not just about saying sorry, it's about learning from this. You don't need to apologize for my sake. But for yourself, for the passengers who have to trust you to get them safely from point A to point B, you gotta take this and grow. It's about the bigger picture." The pilot nodded solemnly, his gaze downcast for a moment. "You're right," he admitted. "I've been in this job for so long that I think I forgot the basics. The respect for every single person, no matter who they are or where they come from. You've reminded me of what's important. Snoop smiled, not in a smug way, but in a way that showed understanding. He knew it wasn't easy to admit mistakes, especially when those mistakes had affected someone else. It took a level of self-awareness that not many people could manage. Just don't forget it, all right? We all have our moments, but that doesn't mean we can't do better, Snoop said with a slight chuckle, clapping the pilot lightly on the shoulder. The pilot stood a little straighter now, the air of self-pity that had earlier hung around him now dissipating. I won't forget it, Mr. Dogg. Thank you for everything. No problem, man, Snoop replied. Now, let's get back to flying this thing and get everyone to their destination, yeah? The pilot nodded gratefully and gestured toward the cockpit. Absolutely. And I'll be making sure the rest of the flight goes as smoothly as possible. As Snoop stepped back into the cabin, he felt a sense of quiet satisfaction. The pilot had taken the first step toward personal growth, and maybe, just maybe, this confrontation could serve as a reminder to others that even the smallest acts of kindness and accountability could lead to meaningful change. It wasn't about the big gestures, it was about doing the right thing when it counted. The rest of the flight continued without incident, and passengers began to settle into a comfortable rhythm. Snoop was no longer the center of attention, which was just the way he liked it. The rest of the journey passed by with ease, and by the time the plane descended toward its destination, the flight had regained its normal flow. The cabin was quiet, the mood light, and even the pilot seemed more at ease, his earlier tension replaced by professionalism. As the plane landed and passengers began to gather their belongings, the flight attendants walked through the aisles, thanking passengers for their cooperation. When Snoop stood up, one of the attendants stopped him, smiling warmly. Mr. Dogg, thank you again for how you handled things earlier, she said. You really saved the situation. I think you've taught us all a lesson about grace under pressure. Snoop grinned, tipping his sunglasses down just slightly. It wasn't me who saved the situation, it was the captain, stepping up and doing the right thing. He just needed a little reminder. But you're welcome though. It's all about keeping it peaceful. The flight attendant smiled, a look of admiration in her eyes. Well, you definitely made this flight unforgettable, Mr. Dogg. And thank you for being a role model. Snoop simply nodded, his expression thoughtful as he moved toward the exit. Just doing my part, he said. Every day's a chance to be better, that's all. As he exited the plane, Snoop paused for a moment to look around. The sun was setting in the distance, casting a warm glow over the tarmac. The day had been full of surprises, but in the end he was proud of how it had turned out. It was about more than just navigating the highs and lows of celebrity life. It was about making a difference where it mattered most. Back in the airport, as he walked toward the terminal, Snoop found himself reflecting on the events of the flight. He had handled the confrontation with the pilot in the way he knew best, not through anger or retaliation, but with the wisdom and calm that had carried him through so much in his life. It wasn't about proving who was right or wrong. It was about showing that we all have the power to change, to grow, and to make the world a little better. And as he stepped into the bustling crowd, he knew that the flight wasn't just another chapter in his busy life. It was a reminder that we all have the ability to shift the course of things, even in the most unexpected situations. The moment had passed, but the lessons from it would stay with him, and with the pilot, and maybe even with everyone who had been on board that flight. The sun had fully set by the time Snoop Dogg made his way through the crowded terminal. The usual buzz of the airport surrounded him, people rushing to catch their next flight, families chatting, and the distant hum of the baggage claim area. Snoop's calm, collected demeanor made him blend in among the crowd, his sunglasses still perched on his nose, despite the dimming light. He had grown accustomed to the public eye, but today he had handled something that went beyond the usual celebrity interactions. His role wasn't just as a famous rapper or an icon. It had been as someone who stood up for what was right in a world that still often overlooked the power of accountability. As he moved through the airport, a few people recognized him, and the whispers began to ripple through the crowd. It was nothing out of the ordinary. People were used to seeing celebrities on the go, but there was a certain warmth in their greetings that felt different tonight. Some passengers who had been on the flight even nodded or gave him a thumbs up. Snoop smiled back, giving them a casual nod of acknowledgement. It wasn't about the fame, it was about what he had done, what they had all witnessed. Just as he was about to reach the escalator leading to the baggage claim, a voice called out from behind him. "Snoop. Yo, Snoop." He turned around to see a young man in his 20s, a wide grin on his face, holding out his hand as he approached. He was dressed casually, a hoodie and jeans, but there was something unmistakable about the way he walked with confidence. Snoop raised an eyebrow but didn't miss a beat as he turned to face him. "What's up, man?" Snoop said, giving him a nod. The young man grinned, shaking Snoop's hand firmly. "I was on that flight. Saw what happened with the pilot, man. You handled that situation like a pro. Honestly, you changed the whole mood on that plane. I was watching and just thinking, this is how you handle things with grace. You really put that dude in his place." Snoop chuckled lightly, the compliment resonating with him. Yeah, it wasn't about putting him in his place, it was about showing him a better way to deal with things. It's easy to snap, but it's harder to stay cool. I just had to remind him of that. The young man nodded enthusiastically. "Damn it. I couldn't believe how calm you were. I'm just saying, you taught me something today. Not just how to stand up for yourself, but how to handle adversity with respect. That's real strength right there." Snoop smiled. "Thanks, bro. Respect's key, you know? We're all human, we all make mistakes. But the real power comes from showing up and owning up when you mess up." "Totally. I hope one day I can handle situations like that, like you did," the young man said, his voice filled with genuine admiration. "Can I get a picture with you?" Snoop's eyes softened, and he placed a hand on the young man's shoulder. "Of course, man. Just remember, it's not the picture that counts, it's what you do with the lesson you take from moments like these." The young man nodded, pulling out his phone. They snapped a quick picture together, the young man beaming with excitement. "You've got my respect, Snoop. Thanks for being real." "No problem," Snoop said with a grin, walking away as the young man stood there still taking in the moment. Snoop knew that the impact of the day, the quiet moments of wisdom and reflection, would stick with the people who had witnessed it. He had proven that confronting hate didn't need to be dramatic. It could be a teaching moment, one where growth and learning took precedence over conflict. As Snoop headed toward the baggage claim, he was met with another moment of recognition. This time, it was an older couple who had been seated in the front of the plane. They walked toward him, the woman smiling warmly. "We just wanted to thank you, Mr. Dogg," she said, her voice full of gratitude, "for what you did on the flight. We saw the whole thing and honestly, we were so uncomfortable with the pilot's comments. But the way you handled it, with such dignity and calmness, it really gave us a lot to think about. You're an example of how we should treat each other, no matter who they are." Snoop smiled, genuinely touched by her words. "I appreciate that. It's not easy to stand up when people are being disrespectful, but the point isn't about me. It's about showing that respect is a two-way street. We all have to learn from each other." Her husband, nodding along, added, "You've changed the way we think about confronting difficult situations. You showed us that there's strength in staying calm, in not letting the hate around you control how you act. You've inspired us, Mr. Dogg." Snoop looked at them, feeling a deep sense of fulfillment. "It's all love," he said simply. "You just gotta approach things with the mindset that we're all in this together." As the couple walked off, Snoop's mind wandered again to the pilot. He knew that the confrontation had been tough for the man, but it had also been a moment of growth for him. And that was the real takeaway from the whole ordeal. Growth wasn't always easy, but it was always possible. Later that evening, as Snoop relaxed in his hotel room, he found himself thinking back to the events of the day. The way everything had unfolded was still surreal. He had been on many flights before, but none of them had ended like this. The pilot's apology had been sincere, and the lessons that had emerged from the situation were still sinking in. But there was also a deeper realization settling within him. He had grown in a way that he hadn't fully recognized until now. He had been in countless confrontations in his life, each one teaching him something different. But today, he had learned that confrontation didn't always need to result in chaos. Sometimes, the best response to hate and disrespect was a simple reminder to respect each other, to rise above the noise and focus on the greater good. Snoop took out his phone and dialed a familiar number, his longtime manager, Dave. After a few rings, Dave picked up. "Yo, Dave, it's Snoop," he said, his tone calm but thoughtful. "Hey, Snoop. How's it going?" Dave asked, his voice filled with curiosity. "It's been an interesting day, man," Snoop replied. "You know that flight I was on? I had a bit of a situation with the pilot." Dave paused for a second. "What happened?" Snoop chuckled, leaning back in the chair by the window. "Well, the pilot was a little off the rails with some comments he made. But I handled it, didn't let the hate mess with me, just spoke to him calmly, showed him another way to approach things. And by the end of it, he apologized. Made me think, man, a lot of people need to see that it's not always about fighting fire with fire." Dave was quiet for a moment, clearly processing what Snoop had just said. "Damn, that's heavy, Snoop. You really turned the whole thing around." "Yeah," Snoop said softly. "I think it's a reminder that we all gotta be responsible for how we show up in the world. You don't have to be aggressive to make a point. Sometimes the point gets made with kindness, with understanding. And that's the real strength." Dave let out a low whistle. "Man, you're out here changing lives even when you don't know it." "That's powerful." Snoop smiled. "Nah, man, it's just about keeping it real. Doing the right thing when it counts." They talked for a few more minutes, but Snoop's mind was already racing with the possibilities. He had used his platform for music, for culture, for entertainment, but today he had used it to make a statement that had been long overdue. And maybe, just maybe, that was the kind of change that would resonate more than anything he'd ever done before. The next day, as Snoop left the hotel for his next engagement, he couldn't help but feel a sense of peace. The pilot had learned something, the passengers had witnessed something profound, and Snoop had walked away with a sense of clarity. It wasn't about the headlines or the applause. It was about the real moments, the ones where you could make a difference, not just in your own life, but in the lives of those around you. And as Snoop stepped into the car waiting for him outside, he knew that, regardless of the challenges ahead, he had made his mark. This was the kind of legacy he wanted to leave behind. The day after the flight incident, Snoop Dogg sat in his hotel room, the soft hum of the air conditioning filling the silence. It had been a few hours since he'd gotten off the phone with Dave, his manager, and he found himself reflecting on the unexpected chain of events. What had started as an uncomfortable and hostile situation had somehow turned into something positive, something meaningful. Snoop leaned back on the couch, his mind wandering to the people on the plane who had witnessed the altercation. He couldn't help but wonder how they were processing everything. For many of them, it must have been their first encounter with this kind of public conflict. He'd made it clear that standing up for yourself didn't need to result in a loud argument. You didn't need to escalate things with aggression or violence. Sometimes, it was about keeping your cool, showing respect, and diffusing tension with understanding. He ran his fingers through his hair and picked up his phone, scrolling through his social media feeds. What he saw caught him by surprise. His feed was flooded with messages from fans and random strangers alike, all expressing gratitude and admiration for how he had handled the confrontation. Some had even gone as far as to write entire posts about how he had used his platform to teach a lesson in humility, respect, and calm in the face of adversity. There were messages from fans who appreciated the way Snoop had risen above the hate, and there were even a few from people who had never been his fans before, now saying they had a newfound respect for him. Snoop couldn't help but smile to himself. The reaction was overwhelming, and while he had always known the influence of his music and persona, this felt different. It wasn't about a hit album or a flashy moment on stage. It was about real change, even if only in a small way. It felt good to know that something so simple could leave such an impact. As he continued to scroll through the messages, one comment stood out among the rest. It was a post from a fellow celebrity, an actor he had met a few times at events. The post read, "Real strength isn't about what you can break, it's about what you can build. Respect, Snoop, for showing us how to handle things with grace." Snoop chuckled to himself, appreciating the sentiment. He had always known that words held weight, and now, it seemed the message was resonating with more people than he had ever expected. But even as the positive reactions filled his inbox, Snoop knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. He had drawn attention to an issue that many people tried to avoid: The pilot's behavior was a reflection of a bigger problem that still existed in society: prejudice, bias, and hate. Snoop leaned forward, picking up the remote control and flipping on the TV. He needed a break from the endless barrage of social media notifications. The news was on, and as the camera cut to a live report from the airport, Snoop immediately recognized the reporter. And in breaking news, the reporter was saying, Snoop Dogg, the legendary rapper, found himself in a tense confrontation aboard a flight earlier this week. In what started as a racist attack from the pilot, Snoop Dogg managed to defuse the situation with a level of composure that stunned many on board. His calm approach not only de-escalated a volatile situation but also sparked a wider conversation about respect, prejudice, and the importance of holding people accountable for their actions. Snoop sat back in his chair, watching as the screen flashed with footage of him from the plane, a few clips from the confrontation and a brief snippet of the pilot's apology. The reporter continued, "While the pilot has since apologized and taken responsibility for his actions, many are still reacting to the message Snoop Dogg conveyed through his actions. Experts are calling it a critical moment in teaching how to stand up against hate without resorting to violence." Snoop shook his head in disbelief. It was surreal, seeing the whole thing play out on national news like this. He had never expected that a simple act of calm and respect would turn into such a widespread discussion. His phone buzzed again with more notifications, some from news outlets, others from people reaching out to express their gratitude. But it wasn't just the positive feedback that caught his attention, it was the sense that something bigger was beginning to shift. He had done what he did to maintain peace, to stop things from spiraling out of control, but now he was starting to see the ripples of that action reaching far beyond what he had expected. It was then that his phone rang. He looked down and saw Dave's name flashing on the screen. He answered quickly. "Oh, Dave. What's up? Man, what's going on with you? You're all over the news." "I've never seen anything like it," Dave said, his voice tinged with awe. Snoop chuckled, leaning back in the chair. "Yeah, man, didn't see this coming. It's crazy. But I guess when you show people a little respect, it comes back around." "Respect? You've sparked a whole movement, Snoop," Dave said, his tone growing more serious. "I've been getting calls from people in the media, from organizations. They want to interview you, they want your perspective on how you handled the situation. People want to hear your thoughts on this moment." Snoop paused, his expression thoughtful. He wasn't the type to chase the spotlight, but he also understood that this was an opportunity. "I don't know, man," he said slowly. "I didn't do this for the attention. I just did what felt right in the moment. But maybe it's time to talk about it. If I can help someone else see a different way to handle this kind of situation, then I'll do it." Dave let out a laugh. "That's the Snoop we all know. All right, I'll set something up. The world needs to hear what you've got to say." Snoop nodded, feeling a sense of responsibility that he hadn't expected. Maybe this wasn't just about handling one confrontation, it was about using his platform, his voice, to make a real difference. The next day, Snoop found himself in a studio, ready to give his first interview since the incident. The room was comfortable, set up with the usual lights and cameras, but there was a sense of weight in the air. The interviewer, a seasoned journalist named Carla, had already interviewed countless celebrities and public figures, but she was clearly aware that this was going to be a different kind of conversation. "Thank you for sitting down with us today, Snoop," Carla began, her tone respectful and warm. "We've all seen the footage of what happened on the plane, and it's clear that your actions made a huge impact. You handled an extremely tense situation with grace and dignity. But I think what everyone is wondering is, why did you choose to stay so calm? Why not just confront the pilot, or get upset?" Snoop leaned forward slightly, his fingers interlaced in front of him as he spoke. "Look, I've been in the game for a long time. I've seen my fair share of adversity. But what people don't realize is that it's not always about fighting fire with fire. Sometimes the best way to deal with hate is to show respect. The pilot was out of line, sure. But he's a human being, just like anyone else. It's easy to get caught up in emotions, but when you respond with anger, you just perpetuate the cycle." Carla nodded, clearly impressed with his response. "So you're saying that showing respect, even in moments of hate, can make a difference?" Snoop smiled. "Yeah, exactly. It's about showing people that there's another way to deal with things. You don't have to fight every battle. Sometimes, the real victory is in teaching people how to treat each other with kindness and dignity. The interview continued, with Snoop reflecting on his career, his life, and the lessons he had learned along the way. But it wasn't just about celebrity or the music industry, it was about the bigger picture. Snoop spoke candidly about his experiences growing up, the challenges he had faced, and how he had always tried to use his platform to lift others up. His calm demeanor and insightful answers resonated with Carla, and by the end of the interview she was not just seeing him as the rapper, but as a man who had learned the value of respect and understanding in a world that often favored division and hostility. As the interview wrapped up, Carla thanked Snoop again for sharing his thoughts. "You've given us all something to think about, Snoop. This wasn't just about you. It was about the way we all handle adversity. And you've shown us that we can do it with grace." Snoop stood up, nodding. "Glad I could help. Sometimes, it's just about showing up and doing what's right, you know? It's all about being the change you want to see in the world." Leaving the studio that day, Snoop felt a sense of peace settle over him. The words had been simple, but they had carried a weight that was more powerful than anything he had ever said in his music. The message was clear: respect, dignity, and grace could change the world, one moment at a time. And today, he had made that difference. The day after the interview aired, Snoop Dogg found himself in a whirlwind of attention, his words echoing across social media platforms and news outlets. The response was overwhelming, but not in the way one might expect from a celebrity with a history of public visibility. This time, it wasn't about his latest album, his brand, or his flashy lifestyle. It was about the raw, honest message he had delivered, a message of respect, accountability, and grace in the face of adversity. It had struck a chord, reaching beyond his usual fan base and into the hearts of people from all walks of life. Snoop sat in his hotel suite, scrolling through his phone as he read the flood of messages. Many of the comments reflected gratitude, while others shared personal stories of times they had faced similar prejudices or disrespect and had been unsure of how to handle it. A few people had even tagged him in posts, saying that they had tried to handle conflicts differently after seeing the way he de-escalated the situation on the plane. But amidst the overwhelming positivity, Snoop noticed something else. There were still some people who were resistant to the idea of handling hate with peace. Some comments criticized his approach, arguing that he should have stood up for himself more aggressively, or that he hadn't shown the pilot enough of a consequence for his actions. Snoop's thumb paused as he read one such comment. It was from someone who identified as a fellow artist, known for being outspoken and confrontational in their own career. Why let him off the hook? Sometimes, you gotta show people who's boss. You can't just let them walk all over you, the comment read. "Snoop's too soft for this world." Snoop sighed, setting his phone down for a moment. He'd heard this kind of sentiment before. People often misunderstood his approach, mistaking his calmness for weakness. But what they didn't realize was that strength wasn't always about fighting back in the traditional sense. Strength was about knowing when not to fight, when to walk away, and when to teach with words rather than actions. His phone buzzed again, this time with a call from Dave. "Yo, Snoop, have you seen the reactions today?" Dave's voice was practically bursting through the phone. "You're trending all over the place, man. Your message is everywhere." "Yeah, I've seen it," Snoop said, picking up his phone again and scrolling through more comments. "It's crazy, right? People actually listening, talking about change. It's a trip. You didn't expect this kind of response?" Dave asked, a hint of disbelief in his voice. Snoop chuckled, leaning back in his chair. "Nah man, not like this. I figured I'd get some attention, but not this much. It's humbling. I'm just speaking from the heart. I'm not trying to be some spokesperson for peace, but if this moment helps someone see things differently, then that's what matters." "Exactly," Dave agreed. "But listen, there's a lot of people asking for follow-up interviews, conferences, and even some podcasts. They want your thoughts on what happened, on how you stayed calm, and how we can keep pushing for positive change." Snoop's brow furrowed. He had done the interview, said his piece, and now, he wasn't sure if he wanted to keep talking about the situation. He had already said all he needed to say about the incident. But he knew that there was an opportunity here to do something bigger, something that might allow him to use his influence to address issues of hate, systemic racism, and the ways society dealt with conflict. "I'm thinking about it," Snoop said slowly. "I get the attention right now, but I'm not about to milk this for all it's worth. If I can use this moment to start a bigger conversation, to start real change, then I'll do it. But I don't want to get caught up in the hype. You know me, Dave. I don't chase headlines." "Yeah, I know," Dave said with a laugh. "But don't underestimate the impact you can have. This moment, man, it could be the start of something. You can inspire more than just your fans. You're influencing the whole world right now. You could really make something out of this." Snoop paused, considering Dave's words. It wasn't about fame or accolades, it was about legacy. If his actions could spark real conversations, then maybe it was worth stepping into the spotlight for a bit longer. He wasn't one to shy away from hard topics, and if he could use his platform to educate, to shift perspectives, then he would. "You're right," Snoop said finally. "Let's see where this can go. I'll talk to the people, but only if I feel like it's going to make a difference. I won't waste time on fluff." Dave's voice sounded relieved. "Good. I knew you'd think this through. You're doing more than just handling the situation, you're laying down a foundation for a conversation that needs to happen." The next few days passed in a blur of interviews, meetings, and media requests. Snoop attended a few roundtable discussions, speaking candidly about his experience and his approach to de-escalating conflict. He also connected with experts in the fields of social justice, conflict resolution, and education, discussing ways to take the lessons from the flight incident and apply them to broader societal issues. Throughout these conversations, Snoop found himself learning too. He didn't have all the answers, but he was keen on listening to others who had been working in these areas for years. The more he learned, the more he realized that true change didn't happen overnight. It was a constant, ongoing process that required everyone to be involved. Change needed to come from the ground up, but it also needed to be supported at every level of society, from individuals to institutions. The conversations didn't always go smoothly. Some people still couldn't understand why Snoop had handled the situation the way he did. Why not confront him more directly? "You were in a position of power on that plane," one journalist asked during an interview. "Why not show him who's boss?" Snoop smiled softly, leaning forward into the microphone. "Being in a position of power doesn't mean you have to flex that power at every turn. It's easy to react with anger or force, but real power is in how you control yourself, how you choose to handle a situation without letting emotions drive you. You can't fight hate with hate. We gotta teach love." That's the message. The journalist seemed taken aback, but nodded slowly, clearly processing what Snoop was saying. As the days passed, Snoop continued to reflect on the broader implications of what had happened. What began as a simple act of standing up for himself on a flight had blossomed into a much larger conversation about respect, self-control, and societal change. He didn't see himself as a hero or a savior, but rather as someone who had simply done what he thought was right. He wasn't interested in being idolized for his actions. He was interested in seeing that people took those lessons and applied them in their own lives. One evening, after finishing another round of media interviews, Snoop found himself in his hotel room, reflecting on the conversations he'd had. He had spoken to so many people, young and old, from all different walks of life, and the common theme that kept emerging was the desire for change. People were tired of the status quo, of the daily struggles they faced, whether it was racism, prejudice, or simply being dismissed. They wanted to be seen, to be heard, to be respected. Snoop smiled to himself. It was clear to him now that the flight incident wasn't just a blip in his career. It was a stepping stone toward something bigger, something that could inspire lasting change. He picked up his phone and dialed Dave once more. "Yo, man," Dave answered, his voice excited. "What's up?" "I've been thinking," Snoop said, his tone deliberate. "I'm ready to take this message further. I'm thinking of doing a tour. Not a music tour, but a speaking tour, talking about respect, accountability, and how we can all work together to make this world a better place." Dave paused for a moment, then laughed. "Damn, Snoop. That's huge. You're really about to change the game with this?" Snoop nodded, looking out the window at the city skyline in the distance. It's time, man. Let's do it. And just like that, Snoop Dogg began preparing for something that would go beyond music, beyond celebrity. He was about to embark on a journey to change hearts and minds, using his voice to inspire a world that desperately needed to hear his message.